All right. Hi, everyone. I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Helen Bonnyman, and I'm a policy associate with New America's Future of Land and Housing program. And as part of our team's work exploring the intersection of climate change and housing stability, we published a policy brief last month profiling an unusual home buyout program in Harris County, Texas, which is home to 4.7 million residents and the city of Houston. In response to Hurricane Harvey's devastating floods in 2017, Harris County is requiring 585 households, including renters and homeowners, and 390 business or property owners to move out of flood-prone, predominantly Latino neighborhoods just north of Houston city limits. Although mandatory buyouts have been implemented in a few other places, Harris County is the first jurisdiction in the country to require relocation at this scale. This program, which is part of a suite of post-Harvey investments called Project Recovery, is one example of the tough decisions that governments at all levels are facing as climate change intensifies. Resident organizing and new program leadership have spurred some improvements and changes related to resident compensation, but as the program is winding down before closing out next year, many households are still searching for affordable replacement housing. Elevating the challenges, successes, and nuances of Harris County's example will hopefully inform other jurisdictions' preparations to address the dual crises of climate change and a national housing shortage. Today, I'm excited to be bringing together a great panel of people who have worked on the program from a variety of angles. We'll be discussing the Project Recovery buyouts in greater detail and adding context from other buyout programs in the Houston area and elsewhere. We'll also be broadening the conversation to talk about the state and federal policy implications of lessons learned from Harris County. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here. Before I turn it over to you to introduce yourselves, I will just reiterate that audience members can submit questions throughout the conversation, and then we'll save some time at the end to hopefully address some of those. So, okay, let's get into it. And Amanda, can I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Hi, and thank you for having me. Amanda Rocha, Director of Policy and Partnerships for Harris County Housing and Community Development. Part of my role focuses on, as I said, policy and partnerships, but some of our currently really large pieces, which include recovery dollars from Harvey, and then, of course, from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, I'll turn it over to Dr. Elise Savar to introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Elise Zavar. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Emergency Management and Disaster Science here at the University of North Texas. I've been researching buyout programs in general for probably close to 15 years now. And since Harvey hit Houston area, I've been kind of embedded in Harris County and researching that particular program and how it's evolved and changed over the years.
Thanks so much. And then finally, we're joined by Anna Weber. If you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. It's great to be with this excellent panel. My name is Anna. I'm a policy analyst at the Natural Resources Defense Council based in the Washington, D.C. area. My work focuses on the federal policy that surrounds buyouts and similar programs to reduce our risk from climate-driven disasters. As part of my work over the past few years in trying to identify policy solutions that help protect people from the effects of climate change and natural hazards, I've been convening conversations with both buyout practitioners and program managers, as well as residents and homeowners who have participated in these kinds of programs. And so I'm going to be providing some sort of big picture context on the program here.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. And now, if you could continue on, Anna's going to provide a little overview of basically what are home buyouts and what do they look like across country. So over to you, Anna.
Great. Thanks. So I just want to provide a little bit of context here for those who might not be familiar with home buyouts and sort of where they sit in our country's preparation for and response to major disasters. So just to zoom out a little bit, I started doing this work about 6 or 7 years ago. And at that time, this is what a lot of the discussion of climate-related relocation was like. There's big, scary numbers. There's years that look like they're really far in the future. And we're talking generally about what's going to have happened by the time we get into the future. We're not really talking yet about how we get from here to there. And I love in this picture, there's this guy who is just taking a leap into unknown territory and assuming he's going to land on dry land. And that's kind of what the conversation about climate mobility was like a few years ago. Next slide. Now we're seeing, even in just the past couple of years, a little bit of a shift. And we're seeing more discussions of things like these headlines, where we have individual decisions about where and how to live informed by current and future risk. It's highly individual in these kinds of situations. Any relocation that's being described in these kinds of stories are done with the resources that people have at hand, the information, the money, the capacity, the understanding of risk, their overall level of choice and mobility in the housing market. Next slide. But we're also seeing more discussion of what we might call supported or assisted relocation. And one of the components of that kind of work is home buyouts, which is what we're going to be talking about here today. And the research and policy attention to these kinds of projects has really exploded in the past few years. There have been large and high-profile buyout projects in response to disasters like Sandy and Harvey, like we're going to be talking about today. But actually, the US federal government has supported tens of thousands of property acquisitions to help people move out of harm's way over the past several decades. Next slide. So what is a home buyout? Well, it's pretty simple on paper. What we have is a situation where someone, typically a homeowner of a single family home, is facing either extreme or chronic flood risk, or maybe risk from some other hazard. They've decided enough is enough. They don't want to pass the buck to anyone else who's living in this risky location. A government agency, typically using federal funding, but not always, steps in, gives an offer to that homeowner, buys them out. They take the money, move somewhere else. The home is demolished and the land is restored and kept as open space to protect the surrounding community. Importantly, for the context of this conversation, most buyouts in the US are what we would call voluntary buyout, meaning that there's no use of eminent domain or any other legal mechanism to force anyone's participation. But even when there is, like in the case we're talking about here today, again, on paper, the process is largely the same. The idea is to compensate residents so that they can move outside of a risky area and the land that they leave behind is preserved for public benefit. Again, that's how it works on paper. Next slide. The reality, of course, is a little bit more complicated, actually a lot more complicated. So as anyone who has worked on any of these projects will know, and frankly, anyone who's ever worked on a federal grant will understand that these kinds of projects are highly complex and they often take a really long time. If we're looking at the entire life cycle of a grant that funds buyouts from the day of a disaster, when the funding is triggered, to the day that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted at the end of a federal grant, that it takes on average over 5 years. And you can see in the diagram here, all of the different players who have to be coordinated and all of the sort of bouncing balls of coordination that has to happen over the course of these projects. One thing that I do want to emphasize is that these long timeframes, along with other complications in the way that these projects are often designed and managed, mean that even when community members desperately want to leave their damaged or flood-prone homes, there aren't always safer homes to move to, especially not for the amounts of money that government grants are willing to pay. And the timeframes involved just compound these issues. And so as a result, buyouts have a lot of inequities that are sort of inherent in the process, as well as being layered on top of all of the other inequities and challenges that already exist in both our disaster and housing systems. And so as a result, buyouts can exacerbate existing inequalities as well as generate new ones. and just being really complicated, uncertain, and stressful for residents who have already undergone possibly the worst and most traumatic experience of their life, surviving a major disaster. And now, as you might hear from participants, layering essentially another disaster on top. Next slide, please. At the same time, though, we're facing a paradox. More and more people need or want to move. And the bottom line is that current process of buyouts, the way that the country has historically done them in the past, can't really even deal with current need and demand, let alone scaling up to larger scopes and overcoming the barriers that are associated with more complex situations like the ones that we're going to be talking about today, let alone centering equity and justice amid the massive devaluation of flood-prone properties and all of the other inequities that are baked into the system. At the same time, though, we're likely still going to need to do these more. Buyouts essentially are the country's primary tool to help people move out of harm's way. And for better or for worse, they're likely to serve as the sort of backbone for any kind of more holistic or comprehensive way that the country approaches land use and housing in the face of climate change. Now, before we move on, I do just want to add a couple of things about the concept of voluntariness, I suppose. I don't know if there's a better word for that when it comes to buyouts. So obviously, if you're legally compelled to participate, that would be a mandatory program, right? As well as under any program, if you're a renter and your landlord decides to sell, that's an involuntary displacement, even in the eyes of the law. But even in so-called voluntary programs, like the typical FEMA programs you might hear about, there's different levels of actual choice that are faced by participants. Even if you can decline an offer, do you have any other options? Will there be any other source of assistance for anything else that you might want to do to reduce your risk? Are you facing pressure from neighbors or community leaders or being offered some sort of financial incentive to participate that you don't feel like you can refuse? If it's feasible for you to stay, do you even want to stay if most of your neighbors are going to be gone? And on the flip side, even in a mandatory program, we have learned through our work that there are things that practitioners and program managers can do to ensure that the participants do have as much agency and self-determination as possible. We're going to be talking about some of those lessons today. So I'm saying all this both to frame the discussion that we're going to be having and to emphasize that while the circumstances of this particular project may be unique, the lessons can really be applied more broadly. Next slide. And for anyone who wants to learn more about what we've been doing at NRDC and with our fabulous group of partners on this issue, feel free to scan the code here or join us on our website, nrdc.org, or climatemigration.org to learn more. I'll hand it back to the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. That was a really wonderful overview of to get us ready for the conversation today. So first, I will turn to Amanda to ask, I guess, if you could provide a little context on, why did Harris County choose to make this program mandatory to accomplish the county's disaster recovery goals?
Thank you, and wonderful job, Anna, on the overview. So I'll start off by saying that Harris County still continues to have a voluntary and an involuntary or mandatory, sometimes use those interchangeably, program. Our flood control district, which is a taxing district, but also its own district or entity based on state law within the county, still runs an voluntary program using FEMA dollars, whereas our program uses one-time CDBG, DR funding, as Anna said, and of course has a tie back to Hurricane Harvey. So my understanding is that several different factors came into play. In 2020, the decision was made by Harris County Commissioners Court, which is the equivalent of the City Council or Board of Executives for other counties across the country. They made the decision based on federal data and then, of course, on local and academic based data that there were properties that were at that time in a voluntary phase, if you will, using the Hurricane Harvey recovery dollars that had no other option to move out of harm's way. So what we mean by no other option is that the term that's used often is hopelessly deep in the floodplain. And this means that no other infrastructure improvement, drainage improvement, retention, detention, other interventions that would of course be overseen by other departments would have a, I would say, meaningful impact, but also at a safety level, an impact that would move them out of harm's way or remove the harm, that would cause the concerning, safety issue we're talking about. And when we say, hopelessly deep in a floodplain, I think what's important to set in terms of context for listeners or the audience is that Houston, if you live in Texas or nearby, is often referred to as the Bayou City. So there are bayous everywhere across. I, as a native Houston, Harris County, resident and Houstonian, I grew up near one. And so what we talk about is not necessarily that you are next to a bayou, but that you are in one that has such a high risk. And so that is what we're targeting here. And so for the 7 properties, so 7, some of them are more like neighborhoods, some of them are areas, regions. The 7 areas that were selected or deemed as part of the mandatory phase of the program are near Greens and Halls Bayou specifically. And many properties, even those that may not be these actual ones, flooded an average of 12 times in the 40 years leading up to Hurricane Harvey. And if you can think of being flooded once, twice, which many Houstonians unfortunately have, including myself, 12 times on any business or family or property in terms of damage or loss of life is another level of concern, right? And so taking on, considering that risk, but also the fact that we have a tieback of funding from Harvey that requires us to use it in a very strict timeline with a very definitive, finite amount of resources. We, Harris County Commissioners Court, saw the need to move into that phase. So the decision was made in 2020, and the mandatory phase began in 2021. And so what that meant is that instead of having an invitation, right, as Anna was saying, it was deemed mandatory that folks move. And I think, if you're in 2020, you're like, oh, 2025 feels like so far away. But in terms of public funded programs and all of the coordination involved, and the many processes that Anna laid out so well visually is 5 years is going to feel like 1 year, to move folks out. And so we previously had an end date of, quarter one, around quarter one, 2025. Thankfully, we have an extension into 2026, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has a whole nother 12 months added to their timeline. It just means that we have a little bit more wiggle room to have, pencils down. So, and I think the other caveat I'll kind of emphasize in talking about the flood controls section of the program is that even those folks that are outside of the mandatory program can still be in harm's way in many other ways. That program only focuses on those that almost have, I would argue, imminent danger in the next flood event. And that doesn't have to be another Harvey. It can just be a flash flood over 20, in terms of 24 hours. And so, there is risk everywhere, but it's like, what risk can we mitigate and what can we not, is part of that, I would say, that decision framework if we were to rewind time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that context. And then Elise, if I could turn it to you, I know we're talking a lot about how this program is unique in some ways, but I know that the use of eminent domain, even in Harris County, is not coming out of nowhere for, flood control context. So if you could provide a little history and context there.
Yeah, absolutely. The mandatories, Harris County in kind of modern history is really only the second city or county we see kind of embracing the HUD funding for the mandatories. However, internationally, non-voluntary relocations are very common, and in fact, more common than the voluntary relocations that we've been doing for about 60 years, primarily funded through FEMA, but also as local kind of capital improvement projects. I think we provided a link to one of our papers, but we looked back at eminent domain and specifically eminent domain use in Harris County for flood control. And in Texas, there are I think it's over 300 entities who are able to use eminent domain to acquire land for the public good. And flood control districts are one of those entities. And so over the past century, Harris County has used eminent domain as one of its tools and funding mechanisms to build infrastructure as well as relocate people out of these high-risk areas. And so while the mandatory funding mechanism is newer and less common in the US, internationally, it's very common. And even in a US context, we've been doing, whether you want to call them forced relocations or mandatory relocations or non-voluntary relocations, but we have been telling individuals or homeowners, property owners, that this parcel of land needs to go towards public good of reducing flood risk, and here's the payout for the property value, and then those individuals have to relocate for the entire history of Harris County. Harris County couldn't have grown and evolved without that flood control to what it is today. So I just want to contextualize that. Yes, mandatories have a new element in terms of how they're being funded, but in no way is this a completely new idea in terms of flood control.
Okay, thank you. And then now I would love for us to be able to talk about some of the challenges that came up during as this program has been implemented. I know we've talked about how, flooding in itself is very traumatic for people who experience that. And then, on the program implementation side, administering a buyout is also really tricky. And so, but now I'd love to talk a little bit about just what were some of the challenges that residents who went through this program or are going through this program have, shared publicly or with, program leadership. And I think, Anna, if I could turn to you first to maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll kick this off and then maybe turn it back to Amanda. I mentioned earlier a project that I've been involved with a number of partners where our goal is to bring together practitioners and program managers who have worked on home buyouts around the country with residents and community leaders who have faced buyouts in their actual neighborhoods and on their actual homes. I'm gonna we're gonna be dropping a link in the chat for Carly. I just put the link that I'm talking about in our side chat so you can see the right one. You can actually hear on the webinar that's linked there some testimony from one of the participants in this Harris County program, talk in her own words a little bit, both about what her flooding experience has been like as well as the buyout project. One of the things that I think is interesting looking back over our conversations about this project as well as others in our workshops is there's actually a lot of similarities between the experiences from this buyout program and from buyout programs that are not technically mandatory. A lot of the same challenges arise. Of course, as we've been talking about, this project is unique, if only for the fact that the timing of the beginning of the project happened at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that really framed the experience of a lot of the participants as they were entering the program. There was so much uncertainty going on already in their communities and around the country. And then to be faced with the prospect of needing to move in the midst of all the other housing challenges that were happening early in the pandemic was something that was really, really front of mind. But the other considerations that came up in our conversations about this project are really, again, conversations that highlighted factors that we've heard from buyout participants around the country. Questions about compensation. How are the compensation levels being calculated? Are we going to be able to relocate to a place that makes sense for our family, for our kids, for our commute, for our small business that we run out of our home? All of these considerations. As well as considerations about who is at the table in making these decisions, who is communicating with us. If we have a question, who can we call? Is the person that we can call going to answer the phone? Are they going to answer the phone in the language that we prefer to use when we talk about complicated topics? All of these considerations are things that are not unique to Harris County, but I think are compounded by the fact that at the end of the day, this is a voluntary program, an involuntary program.
Thank you. And then, yeah, Amanda, if you have anything to add in terms of what you heard from residents facing challenges in the program, and then if you don't mind adding any steps that Harris County has taken to address them, and in particular, like what is the county and what are residents still grappling with today?
Yeah, so to give you a scale and to connect it back to something Anna was talking about is in terms of scale, I think is what a lot of folks are often like taken aback by. At this moment, approximately we have at least, I tried to pull up some latest figures from last month, but we have over 975 total transactions. And so what we mean by transactions is some people don't need to be bought out if, move, they're bought out, but they don't relocate. If it was property they owned, maybe that they had like a horse on or something like that, or that, they had just vacant land, or they weren't living there for whatever reason. And so, and we now have about 134 households that are remaining to move as of last month. So that is probably a maximum number since it's continued to dwindle, of course, over time. So yes, we are in the last leg of the program, but also the folks that are remaining are not the simple, turnkey, very one and done cases. These are folks that have, the most personal challenges and the most complicated cases, and that's, many of the times as a result of other challenges they've faced, and so I think, many of the things I'm going to list are just a result of the fact that federal buyout policy sees a buyout of a property as just that. It doesn't start with pulling in some basic social work, because I have a social work background. Does not start with person and environment, right? This does not start with the fact that most of the folks, like Anna was saying, that may live in low, what is considered low value land by the federal government, often have challenges with their commute, access to work, access to healthcare, all the many challenges that we've seen that I think part of a more national conversation, thankfully, in the last year or two about housing affordability and those economic challenges. I think those frame really well the challenges that we've seen when working with some of the most vulnerable and most vulnerable residents, but also those with the most challenges. And so my boss and our executive director, Tal Costas, came to the department in early 2023, and I came over from a different department soon after. And, one of her first priorities at that time was to kind of assess and answer the question of what you're asking, Helen. And, first of all, dissatisfaction with case management at that time, and what felt like insufficient benefits for residents. And what I mean by that is that, one, the federal government's calculation that we all have to follow, no matter level of program, when buying out and relocating someone, is very, I would say, definitive. Doesn't leave a lot open for interpretation in terms of timeline, calculation, et cetera. And also has a lot of restrictions that don't benefit folks that are vulnerable, that speak another language, that have all these other challenges that you would expect for someone in this program. And that includes folks that are not U.S. citizens. And so another thing is the program timeline and the impact on residents. Although we were saying how, 5 years is about average, that's about right. But for someone that needs to move in 12 months, it feels very different when you have that notice. And if you've ever moved and you've even had a more flexible schedule, from the time that you move and to get settled, it's not 12 months, right? And then, I would say that communication, I think, was always a challenge, right? And I think that was really hampered or hamstrung by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Folks, human beings, need to hear things in many different ways, repetitively, and writing, in person, have a contact, have clear expectations. And that was not always done to our understanding from the very beginning of the program, and as just practitioners on a very basic level. And so, and then I would say the very last thing is a lot of, and this is there's public servants on the line, you understand this, there's many of the things that end up becoming the biggest challenges are the unknown or uncontrollable factors. So eminent domain court, which is done outside of a body that's this department, financial processes that we have to follow as a government agency, and program guidelines. And then I would say a lot of coordination with all of our partners, flood control, engineering department, et cetera. I think those areas probably summarize our biggest challenges. I don't think any of them, many of them I think are moot now, thankfully, but others we're going to continue to work on and improve. So I would say for the dissatisfaction with case management or just otherwise like staff engagement, we quickly assigned, field offices in person to have field office hours, if you will. So literally a trailer or another sort of physical office that people could feel like they can come in during to say hi or to just talk through something or to make an appointment. And with that case management support, also ensuring that there is like one person that they can contact, like we were talking about earlier. This is their person on their case. If they need a certain language, making sure that the person that's assigned to them speaks that language, et cetera. On the insufficient benefits, and I think this is a really huge one, is we are often in these programs doing it as a result of recovery funding. So it's not like we have, any extra funding. In fact, our department pretty much only exists at the mercy of federal funding, which is usually one time. And so with that said, we're using the funding that we have, and we don't have a lot of ability outside of that to color outside the lines, right? And so with that said, we had a huge need for those that didn't qualify for federal funding. And that becomes a huge issue because then at that point, like I think Anna and Elise were saying, it's involuntary or it's voluntary, it still has the same effects because we can force someone, in many ways to move out. But if we aren't providing them with the assistance to relocate in a more equitable or reasonable way, we are just as disadvantaged, right, in being able to help that person and meet our grant goals at the end of the day. And so Commissioner's Court approved over $8 million in support in order to ensure that those that didn't otherwise qualify for the same URA benefits will basically receive a match. And so that just ensures that no matter if they're a renter, owner, et cetera, of property, that they're going to receive the same level, no matter their ability to qualify for federal rules or federal policies that we're indebted to. And then I think the last couple of things about program timeline and, the most challenging cases, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is just being a lot more clear, being a lot more creative, knocking on doors, having teams that are assigned to reach out to someone in person, ensuring that folks that are in the remaining active or open cases, that they are talking to someone from our program at least once a month. Obviously, if they're in a tighter timeline, more often than that. And then I think lastly, we're talking about this, that there's so many on top of Anna's slides about the process. There's so many processes within those processes and so many partners. And so being really aggressive about building good partnerships with those folks. So who do we need to talk to at the county attorney's office, or who do we need to talk to at flood control engineering to move up certain processes or to resolve this issue that's ongoing? And so I think it's, owning our role, being clear about our role, because a lot of, I feel like frustration out of this program has become that either expectations were drawn out differently or they weren't clear. And I think we've all been in the other end of that case where we were given different expectations and reality was much different. And that has real effects at the end of the day for people that, are forced to move. And so I think looking forward, I said we have 134 cases. So I think it's like implementing a lot of those lessons learned and also ensuring that we have all the things ready to go to, make folks as reasonably, comfortable and set up for success in this next chapter.
Shoot. Okay. Sorry. Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, I did want to dig in a little bit deeper on, kind of a pretty big ongoing challenge today is those 134 households you mentioned who are still looking for housing after, either after or they're in the process of selling or their landlord is selling to the county. And so I wanted to turn to Elise to maybe contextualize that challenge a little bit of people finding adequate and affordable relocation housing after they move. And I know some of your research touches on kind of the spatial relationship between areas of flood risk, housing affordability. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amanda and Anna have already kind of hinted at some of the demographics and some of the social economic considerations here, but the reality is there's decades upon decades of research that shows, land that is chronically flooded, land that has high risk for flooding and other hazards, tends to be lower valued than non-hazardous land. And so that means who is more likely to live in these very flood-prone areas? Typically people who are lower economic status, but also individuals who come from communities that have been harmed by racist housing policies, policies that exclude, whether it's by deeds or by what mortgages are going to be backed or what financing is going to be supported. And so we see a higher percentage of lower income residents, communities of color, the intersections of both of many of those groups as well, who are more likely to live in a floodplain. Putting that in context of Harris County, I think the latest figures came out that 50% of the county is in a known mapped floodplain. And I say known mapped because the second we create a flood map and we determine these flood zones, it's out of date because there's other development and there's environmental changes. And so it's an ongoing process we can never kind of keep up with. We're always kind of behind. And so you have nearly 1,000 households in this program. And at the same time, you have thousands, I think it was about over 3,000 households being relocated through FEMA funding post-Harvey. And then you have all of the other individuals who are in recovery because their homes sustained damage, but maybe they didn't need to relocate out, or they're waiting for elevations or other type of mitigation services. And at the same time, you have construction workers and you have all of the relief aid workers who now flooded into, no pun intended, I mean, there's a bad word to use, but all these individuals have come into the county to help in the recovery efforts. And housing just becomes an even more in demand feature. Harris County, I think, does a really excellent job of ensuring and requiring that their relocated households are moving outside of mapped flood zone areas. That's a lesson many other counties and buyout programs could take and implement. But that means there's a housing shortage, and there would be a housing shortage regardless of the flood history, but that's just compounding it. And then when you have individuals who have less economic buying power, trying to find households and new homes that are still close to work or close to school or nearby transit or maintaining their social connections in their neighborhoods, we're just adding more and more layers onto the difficulty of what the housing market really looks like for those individuals. I've done a lot of work in buyout programs in a lot of communities across the United States. I think Harris County has some of the more organized processes in trying to identify resident assistance and providing some of the wraparound services. Those things like housing, having a relationship with realtors who can help identify potential homes, providing moving assistance costs, things beyond just the value of the house. Because the reality is you've gone through 12 floods. There's no way just refunding the one-time value, pre-flood value of that house is going to make that household whole. And I just want to also kind of reference one other group here that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is residents of trailers. And so trailers are very tricky because oftentimes residents may own the trailer, but they don't own the land that the trailer resides on. And so they fall into this kind of third category. They're not really renters, they're not really owners. And so in Texas and Harris County, we have a very high percentage of communities that are occupied by trailers. And then oftentimes they're also in floodplains and high risk areas. And so I just kind of want to add in what we kind of consider Esther Sullivan work on the third housing group, being trailer owners, because they're often excluded from this conversation, and therefore they're excluded from the policy component to provide those services.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elise, for bringing in the manufactured housing component, because there are several hundred, I believe, households who would fall into that category who are receiving these buyouts.
And I will add many of the, that to Elise's point, there's a lot of, it's a huge data point in all of our folks that we are either buying out and relocating, as we were talking about, and it becomes even more complicated overall if you're a renter versus an owner of property. And on top of that, if you happen to be a renter and we're living, in a trailer, because it is its own level of complication. And I will say some of the most complicated cases, or those just broadly that are remaining, many of them, I don't want to say most, but many, a sizable number are in trailers.
Yeah, thank you for that context. Well, Elise, you also teed us up pretty well to kind of step back a little bit and broaden the conversation to think about policies at different levels that enable this type of programming. So first I'm going to pass this to Anna, but if others have stuff to add on afterwards, feel free to jump in. But I wanted to see if we could talk about how state and federal policy could better support jurisdictions conducting buyouts, whether mandatory or voluntary. And just generally, how can policy at all levels support residents and property owners going through buyouts?
Well, that's a big question, and we're not going to solve it here in the next 20 minutes. But there are some highlights from the work that we've done and the work that others have done that I do want to point to. Many of these points have already been raised by Amanda and Elise. I think the largest sort of framing that we can give to this is the fact that historically, and the way that buyout projects were sort of originally conceived, designed, and implemented, they were meant to reduce risk on a particular property. The entire focus is about hazard mitigation for a specific lot, a specific location. This is both very individual and very, very property focused. I think what everyone here today has been talking about is that is backwards. Sure, if you remove a building from a particular piece of land, there's not any risk there anymore, quote unquote, because there's nothing that can be claimed to an insurance policy if it floods again. But what happens to the people who actually live there? And so many of the policy recommendations, as well as sort of like more detailed programmatic recommendations for states and localities who are doing these projects, is to flip that conception and make it begin and end with the person rather than the property. What does the person who lives on the property need? Not what should they get to be compensated for what they lost, but what do they deserve in order to move forward with their lives? As we've been talking about, a lot of federal grant programs, which make up the bulk of buyout funding in the US, don't really build that in very well. Amanda was talking about how in Harris County, the county was able to allocate local funding to fill in some of these gaps left by the federal program, to provide what we might call wraparound services, and to supplement what the federal money was not willing to pay for. Harris County is a really big place with a big tax base, and has the ability to allocate local funding if it needs and wants to. But many places around the US, especially places that are seeing increasing flood risk, do not have that ability. They do not have the capacity, the staff, the money, the tax base, even to access federal grants in the first place, let alone to use their own money and resources to fill in the gaps around that federal funding. So at the end of the day, a lot of our policy recommendations actually come back to this concept of capacity building, and it's not just for buyouts, but for all of the considerations around climate and natural hazards and housing and all of the other factors that are sort of forming the basis for vulnerability in our communities. So some of the things that we advocate for at NRDC include increasing the amount of money in federal grants that is tagged specifically for local capacity building. A lot of federal money has to go towards things where you're essentially putting a shovel in the ground. But we also need fundings for local and state governments to just build their staffing and knowledge and expertise to be able to do these programs in a respectful and dignified and effective way. The other big component that I want to point to is the ability of people who work on buyout projects and governments who implement them to actually apply the lessons that have been learned in the past. And that's really a driving force behind the collaborative work I've been talking about here today. Historically, buyouts involved a lot of reinventing the wheel. Often they're happening after a major disaster. It's a crisis situation. You get a federal grant if you're lucky and have enough ability to do so. And then you have to implement it really quick. And you're just going to do whatever you can to get that money out the door and help the people in your community that need to be helped. And that really doesn't lend itself very well to innovation. So what we're trying to do in our work is to bring together the lessons of both people who work on these projects as well as people who have lived through them, document their experiences and lessons, and try to drive that back into future projects so that we're not just reinventing the same mistakes of the past. Another thing that I think is really critical is that buyout projects are very isolating. That's like maybe the number one thing that we hear, not just from residents, but also from practitioners and program managers who are trying to implement these programs. If you're a floodplain manager in a local community, chances are you have never done a buyout project before. If you do a good job, whatever that might mean in your community, hopefully you never have to do one again. If you're a resident, certainly hope you've never gone through one before, and we certainly hope you're never going to go through one again. And when you're done, you've probably become an absolute expert in the processes that you just lived through. But by the nature of a buyout project, you are taking that expertise and moving it outside of the community, almost by definition. And so it can be really, really hard to find people who are going through the same things that you have gone through, as well as to apply those lessons in the future. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do through our work. And a lot of our other partners in this space and researchers and academics and policymakers are also working on.
Thank you so much. That was a really fantastic response. I know we don't have too much time before we turn to audience questions, but I think this is a pretty important question and kind of, the crux of what we're hoping to get at here. So I did want to open the floor to Elise and Amanda, if either of you have something to add about just like how policy frameworks can support implementing and also experiencing as a resident going through this type of program.
Yeah, I just want to highlight one of Anna's last points, which is and a goal for our department and that we're actively working on is we need baseline annual funding to ramp up, ramp down, and to do this work year round, because a lot that has changed since Harvey, the event itself, occurred, is a national affordable housing crisis, and we're no different in Houston. Yes, we have a lot more resources and know-how, which I'm so grateful for, and we have so much opportunity and political support locally to get there. But the goal is no different, and so we one example of that I'll say quickly is that I was talking earlier when I introduced myself that some of my biggest focuses right now are helping to advise or oversee certain projects and certain teams that are focused on our recovery dollars. And our question to ourselves in strategic planning this past year has been what after 2026, pretty much. ARPA funding as a response to COVID, the county got almost $1 billion based on our need and our population. Harvey, for DR alone, we got actually less than COVID, which is interesting. But all of that is a lot of money, yes, but many of that is in 2019 and 2020 dollars. And the need always outpaces what the resources that we receive to do it. And so, this work has to be done over and over. And the folks that often become a victim to these events are those that are already facing many socioeconomic challenges long before the event itself. So.
I just tie in one more point. Whenever I get the chance to say this to an audience, I like to take the opportunity, but all mitigation in the United States tends to be very reactionary, and that's because that's when the funding comes in. And so this is not unique to Harris County. This is a national policy program. And so there has been attempts and there's been more push to move more funding towards pre-event mitigation. And buyouts are a type of mitigation, even though they're treated as a recovery mechanism. And so that challenge right there is one of the main crux of the problem in terms of how the federal policy shapes this as a mitigation, but we fund it as recovery. And most households, when I've done interviews, people see this as the thing to get them back to recovery. And so if we not only are able to shift federal policy and encourage more pre-event, but also take individuals out of having to make relocation decisions, or even experience relocations if they aren't making those decisions outside of the time compression of recovery. And so when you have the natural cycle of somebody ready to sell their home, and if communities already have mapped up and know this is a property that we need to acquire, this is a property that shouldn't go on the open market, we don't want to put another family in this location, and have the funds available, because both those things have to happen, the planning and the funding and the resources, then those properties can be acquired outside of the stress of a disaster scenario. And Harris County, I know in the flood control district, has, and again, the resource availability has been able to, keep an eye on properties, and when they come up on the private market, they're able to pool that. For many communities, that's just outside of the scope of their resources and ability. But if we can shift federal policy so that we have more of those resources available, and it doesn't become just this reaction to a disaster. And tied with that, if we also recognize that the individuals that participate in a buyout program, whether it's non-voluntary or mandatory or voluntary, those individuals are making sacrifices. If we kind of reframe the buyout program as we're doing this for the good of the whole of the community, but the individual households, while they receive benefits towards it, it is still a sacrifice to give up their home and their attachment to this place. We might be more willing to offer more funding and more resources and more services to those individuals, recognizing that the true benefits are coming at a community-wide level, where now my neighbor doesn't live there, but the water can sit there and it's not in my property. And so kind of reframing away from this idea that we're gifting people buyouts, but recognizing that they've made a sacrifice too for the wellness of the whole.
Absolutely, and well said, thank you. And on that note of, just adequate funding to support this in a holistic way, I guess we don't have time, unfortunately, to address all of the really wonderful comments we're getting from the audience, but someone did note about Texas's budget surplus, and I thought that was really interesting to bring up, so thank you for that. And Amanda, I don't know if you were able to have a really, really quick comment about collaboration with the state here before we move on, but I did just.
First of all, we gladly take the funding for housing, et cetera. I will say the DR program was done in partnership with the Texas General Land Office, who is the state's designated, or at least for that disaster, I'll say, designated recipient and of the Harvey dollars broadly, because their Harvey's event, although many folks see it on the mainstream as Houston, it hit a lot of Texas communities, many without our same resources. And so I think, we can all do a lot more. And I think, unfortunately, these events are not going to decrease in intensity or in quantity in the coming months, as we've seen. And so, it's going to require everyone moving in the same direction, and not just federal partners, state partners, local advocates, as Anya talked about, and more. And so, we have to do more. I mean, honestly, I don't see another way.
Yeah, thanks so much. All right, and so I think we sadly only have time to take one other question, but and and this is kind of a doozy for our last 5 minutes. So, you know, we're gonna see what we can cover. But someone asked, you know, really intriguing question is about, so if these properties are so deep in the floodplain, then there's no way to fix the flood problem. If buyouts aren't done, is there an alternative for, you know, other tools that we have for when the risk level is this high? Elise, I see you shaking your head if you want to jump in here.
Sure, I can fill this one. Oftentimes buyouts are the last resort. They're very costly, not just in terms of economics, but they're also costly in terms of time of staff, time of training, grant writing, and then of course the residents' experience. And so most communities, I actually can't think of a community that picks buyouts if there's another alternative. Most of the times, depending if, especially if it's a federal funded, you have to do a cost benefit analysis to prove, you know, the buyout is the most viable option. And so I cannot think of a community where they would choose to start with the buyout program before looking to see, can we do elevations? Is there a structure that we can build that can divert water? Is there a basin that can come in? Buyouts are really kind of seen as the last resource. And in many ways, the buyout is essentially correcting bad land use kind of decision made, you know, decades, if not hundreds of years ago. And so with that kind of philosophy in mind, we always try and keep people in their homes. We try and keep people in place as much as we can. But some places, you know, 12 floods, that's just not going to be a viable option anymore.
Definitely. And if I could add on a quick follow-up to that, you know, based on what you're seeing in your research, do you anticipate that involuntary or mandatory buyouts, do you anticipate that increasing in the future elsewhere?
Yes. Both, yes. The reality is just thinking about sea level rise and the number of properties that are at risk in the United States to sea level rise, not to mention changing weather patterns with climate change. And it's not necessarily that all places are going to be more wet or more dry, but maybe a location used to get 10 inches of rain across 6 months, and now they're getting 10 inches of rain in a matter of 1 month. And so the infrastructure is just not built to handle that amount of water. And again, if you're thinking about all other options being exhausted, there's going to be places that are just not habitable as we move forward and as climate change continues to impact, especially our water resources and how water is distributed.
If I can add one thing to that, the most common and sort of most emphatic recommendation of all of the residents that I have worked with across this home buyout work, their top recommendation is actually to stop building in harm's way. Their top recommendation is not anything to do with their own experience. With a buyout, their top recommendation is to make sure that nobody else has to go through what they have gone through. And it is, I think, a responsibility, particularly in areas that are doing buyout projects, to make sure that at the same time that you're spending all of this time, money, and stress and uncertainty to move people out of the floodplain, that you are not also turning around and putting more people in harm's way on the other side of the coin. There's been some research in North Carolina, for example, that shows that for every home buyout that's done in the state, there's 10 more homes that are built in the floodplain over the period of time that this study looked at. Home buyout participants are often really understandably angry that they had to be in this position in the first place. No one ever told them that this was going to have to happen, and they don't want to see anyone else go through it. And so I think this also feeds into a larger conversation about land use and housing. We need more housing, but we need to do it in a safe and smart way. An affordable home can't be a dangerous home. And so at the same time that we're thinking about how to move people out of harm's way, we also have to be thinking about not just where those individual residents are going to go after they move from a buyout, but what are our communities going to look like in a big picture way under these conditions that they weren't originally built for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for adding that. Well, it looks like we're at time, so I'll have to wrap us up here. But I just wanted to thank you all again for participating in this conversation. This is you know, a really heavy topic for the people who experience it, and just hoping that, you know, this information we've shared today can help others who are researching and implementing this type of program to take these lessons learned and, you know, focus on equity and justice in other buyouts implemented elsewhere. So thanks so much. There will be a recording of this on New America's website, and we'll also be, you know, reposting a lot of the wonderful resources shared in the chat today that were passed along by these panelists. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Helen.